as we continue to discuss the Israel-Iran conflict and, of course, the U.S.'s strikes within Iran yesterday. It's now been about 24 hours since it happened. A live look at the White House, where it's just past 9 p.m. in the nation's capital. Also, our normal live vantage points of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, where it's the early morning hours Monday morning there. We're starting off our coverage tonight with Dr. Alon Burstein. We're going to be doing an extended segment with Alon. Alon, this is the first time that you and I have talked since yesterday's strikes. You and I have talked on the weekly just about since October 7th, 2023. We have followed the war in Gaza. We've talked extensively about the history of the conflicts in the Middle East. I got to ask you, this is something that came up to me earlier today. Is it fair to say, Alon, that the October 7th attack basically led to the elimination or the near elimination of all of Israel's prime foes?
It's good to see you, Austin. There's a lot of people who are trying to frame it that way, primarily within the Israeli government right now. I think it's a little premature to say that. Only 2 months ago, Israel was talking about the revolution that happened in Syria as a jihadi revolution. They were talking about Ahmed Ashara as the new descendant of Osama bin Laden that is fooling the West and everything. And then the moment Trump met with Ashara in Saudi Arabia and decided that, he was going to remove the sanctions in Syria and give Syria a chance, all of a sudden Israel's negotiating with Ashara and talking to him as best friends. So things are very fluid within the Middle East. Hezbollah has been largely, I wouldn't say defeated, but certainly deterred, and its power in Lebanon and as a threat to Israel has shrunk dramatically. That's not the first time that happened to Hezbollah. It's certainly the first time it happened to Hezbollah in the last 20 years. But prior to that, Hezbollah had been hit time and again in the 90s, in the early 2000s, and it managed to rebuild its strength. We really don't know. The Middle East is an extremely volatile place. Right now, the way we are standing right now in June of 2025, there are certainly less active actors that are threatening Israel than there were on October 6th of 2023 with regards to the external enemies of Israel. If we look at Hezbollah, if we look at the militias that were operating freely under the Assad regime in Syria, if we look at Iran, certainly there are those on the one hand. On the other hand, over the last week, millions of Israelis have been in bunkers. Israeli streets are looking, I hate to say it, but to some extent, parts of them are looking like Gaza with the extent of 1-ton missiles that are being dropped on them. And that is still going on. There were alerts that went off in Tel Aviv an hour ago, and missiles were fired. And last night at this hour, missiles struck Nes Ziona, Haifa, and Tel Aviv. So it's a constantly fluctuating situation. Iran is certainly weakened and deterred. Israel has shown a lot of superiority in its military, and certainly with the United States' help in Iran. But the situation is still fluid, and something we haven't spoken about in the last couple of weeks. Gaza's still there. Hamas is still alive. Active fighting still happened. 3 IDF soldiers were killed just in the last week. So it's true that Israel, the different enemies that prior to October 7th had been sort of standing tall, each and every one of them has been beaten back, some quite severely. I would, though, say it's premature to say they've disappeared and that that the threats have been removed.
We saw Secretary of State Marco Rubio earlier today appearing on Fox News Alone. He says the U.S. is not at war with Iran. That was the first question they asked him, point blank, are we at war? He said no. You study wars, Alon. How is war defined, and does the situation between the U.S. and Iran fall within that definition?
A wonderful question. I'm going to try not to give too much of an academic answer because there's lots of definitions of war, right? Some people say that war is when a country employs violence against another country that leads to a certain amount of deaths. So some people define it by the amount of deaths, because if there's cross-border insurgencies like between India and Pakistan, or even between Israel and Syria, does that constitute a war at that point? At what point does it have to be a war? Do the sides have to declare war? That used to be the thing. Prior to World War II, it was a custom that enemies would declare war before they went to war. The United States declared war on Japan when it went to war, declared war on Nazi Germany. So some people associate war with that. The current context, though, are you at war or are you not at war, has a lot more to do. I always bring you back to this. with internal politics. There are a lot of repercussions to the United States officially saying that it goes to war. This means that different committees have to be convened. This means this has implications with regards to budgets. This has implications with regards to who is in charge of what when it comes to deploying military and etc., as opposed to a military operation. A military operation is something that the president can order. There's the dispute whether he needs congressional approval or not. But either way, the fact is that that is something that's a lot easier to actually declare in the United States rather than declaring war. Something that I'll also add, there is, for similar reasons and a reverse situation, that Israel declared war on Hamas on October 7th, 2023. That, when a lot of people asked me then, what is the meaning of that? I said, it's for internal political reasons. Israel had been fighting Hamas since Hamas was created, and certainly since, the Hamas took over the Gaza Strip 2007 or October 7th, 2023. Declaring war was done for internal political reasons. It liberated a lot of the political restraints that the Israeli government would have with regards to deploying troops and making decisions, setting up a war cabinet, and things like that. The United States right now is in a reverse position. Trump does not want to be in a position where this is a declared war. He wants this to be a military operation. And the last thing I'll say, that also has to do with Trump's external policy. It's not just about towards internal politics. Externally, he wants the message to Iran to be, we don't want to be at war. Trump does not like wars. We do not want to be at war. We wanted this to be a military operation. And as far as we're concerned, it can be done. Now the ball's in your court. Do you want it to be done or not? If Trump would say, no, this is a war, okay, then Iran's at war. And the United States are at war. Whereas Iran could theoretically decide today, we're not retaliating and that's it. And then there is no war. Then that was an operation and it's over.
Let's read some of what President Trump has said. He posted this. It's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be a regime change? Make Iran great again, he says. How significant is the appetite for regime change among the Iranian public alone? Will the supreme leader likely need to be eliminated to cause regime change, or can a regime change happen without him being targeted?
So when I saw, that message that was put out by Trump, first of all, I chuckled about his hatred of political correctness, and things like that, which I thought was an interesting anecdote that he threw in. But in general, it really mimicked to me a little bit the progression that happened within the Israeli government over the last week when Israel initially launched its attack on Iran on June 13th. It openly said that it is not going for regime change, that it is going for the nuclear facilities, the ballistic capabilities, the way Iran is a threat to Israel. Then, with the seeming success of the initial attacks, the mass amounts of assassinations that Israel successfully carried out, the attacks on the nuclear sites, and Iran's complete collapse of its defense capabilities, all of a sudden in Israel, they started to talk about regime change. They started talking about maybe yes, and they started to attack also the different symbols of government. Similarly, when the United States launched the initial bombing, CBS reported that the Trump administration actually sent messages to Iran saying we are not interested in regime change. We are not looking to attack the regime. We're only going after the nuclear facilities. Don't feel like this is now something that your life is in danger of the life of the regime. This is the nuclear facilities, and it can end there. But possibly with the success of that, and the fact that Iran has not come back to a deal yet, maybe the appetite has grown in the United States as well. So that's just, in terms of the progression over the last 24 hours, that's a very different style message coming out from the administration than happened when the attack was launched. Now, in terms of what are the possibilities for regime change in Iran, we talk about this a lot. We often say, and it's being thrown around the Middle East, certainly in Israel, Europe, the United States, maybe there'll just be a regime change. It's not that simple. There is a strong opposition in Iran. There are supporters of the sons of the Shah. There are supporters of a more broad revolution. Some are just reformists. Some want the entire system of the Islamic Republic taken down and to restore the days of a much more westernized society. Some talk about democracy. Some talk about other things. There's also communist elements there still. At the same time, if we look comparatively in the region, it's not always a straight line that you just topple an oppressive regime and then all of a sudden a flourishing democracy. Obviously we have the damning examples of Afghanistan and Iraq and saying if we just decapitate the leadership, a thriving democracy will flourish. We have seen that that's not true. But even if we look deeper, even if we look at, okay, let's say it's not just about decapitation, let's say it's about the actual people uprising. Throughout 2011, 2012, all the way until the beginning of this year with Syria, we've seen a lot of changes that happened in the Middle East. Called the Arab Spring, Iran, not an Arab country, but certainly within the Middle East. And the nature of the regime really has an effect on even if there is a rebellion, how does it play out? And when we saw situations where there was, I will say, simple dictatorship, so to speak, when it wasn't a very strong government leadership set up, it was a dictator that was simply oppressing the people, like in Libya, like in Yemen, like in Syria. In those situations, when there was a rebellion, eventually the country almost disintegrates. Syria, we're not sure where it's going yet. But in Yemen and in Libya, there's the decapitation, so to speak, and then different factions come up. In turn, in countries like Egypt, where there was Arab Spring and Hosni Mubarak was thrown out of office, there the regime very quickly reestablished itself within 2 years and was able to rebuild. And now we have a Sisi as president who is not as oppressive as Mubarak, but is not that different either in terms of oppressing the opposition. Similarly, in Iran, Iran is not just a ruthless dictator that is ruling alone, Khamenei, and has no following. And if you decapitate him, then all of a sudden the entire regime. That's what happened in Syria. Assad left, and all of his advisors and all the military all of a sudden just disintegrated. Iran is built, the regime is built on a much more solid ground. It has political parties that it allows to run as opposition and coalition in order to keep up the pretense of some sort of democracy, some sort of elections. It has a lot of support within the different social fabrics within the country. There's a lot of opposition, but also a lot of social support. So it's not going to be such a smooth process. Even if Khamenei, which we're seeing on screen right now, even if he was killed, he was assassinated, he has already signaled out in the last week in anticipation of his possible assassination. He's already signaled the 3 potential successors that should take over in his place. Now, so if he's gone, again, unlike Libya, where Gaddafi was gone and then there was no continuation to his administration, here, there would be an organic continuation. Now, it's possible there will be a mass rebellion and everything will change. It is also equally likely, though, if he's assassinated, there'll be a new leader that will come up. Maybe there'll be some changes, but it's not going to be the complete overhaul that happens instantly that I think a lot of people are in the West sort of wishing for.
Why hasn't the supreme leader been targeted yet?
I think for a couple of reasons. One, I think that countries are probably leaving that as an additional option. They're constantly saying, we can do this. And again, Israel openly said initially that it was not going to target the supreme leader, then said, well, actually, no one has immunity. And when the hospital in Israel in Beersheba was hit, all of a sudden Israel said we're going to up the ante and started to say that like Yahya Sinwar and like Ismail Haniyeh, who was assassinated in Tehran, all such leaders like Khamenei know what their destiny is, which is already implying he will be assassinated. So possibly Israel's looking to this, but they want to keep this as a card in their back pocket. So that's one thing. They want it to be a constant threat. A second possibility is that there is a genuine fear of who may come next. Khamenei is relatively old. He's, certainly an extremist in every sense of the word, but there are more extremists that may come up, and certainly a young charismatic leader who might replace him, who then wants also to take vengeance for his assassination, could be a worse option. Also possible that his replacement would be a reformist and someone who would say, okay, we're done with the nuclear program. It only brought devastation to us. That's possible. But I think there is fear about that. And a third facet that has to be remembered is we are used to, when we talk about the Middle East, we're used to talking about asymmetrical warfare. We are used to talking about, these quote unquote targeted assassinations of the leaders of Hamas, of Hezbollah, of Al Qaeda, of ISIS. This is different. This is the, like it or not, accepted legitimate leader, whether it's actually legitimate by the people or not, by international law. It is the accepted legitimate leader of a country. It is very complicated internationally to justify such an assassination. Does that mean that it wouldn't happen? No, absolutely not. It could happen, and Israel could, bear the brunt of it, or theoretically the United States or anyone could bear the brunt of it. But it's not something that would have any acceptance by international law, and also has a lot less precedent. A country assassinating the leader of another country, and this has been talked about a lot with Iran possibly trying to assassinate Donald Trump. A country assassinating the leader of another country is very different than a country assassinating the leadership of a terror organization. So we look at Iran and see the support for Hezbollah, the support for the Houthis, the support for Hamas, but it is still a functioning country, and that also adds a lot of layers of complication, I would suggest.
We got some video, Alon, of the B-2 bombers returning home after the military operation. This is not live. Iran says that it will decide the timing, nature, and scale of its response to the attacks. This has made lots and lots of Americans wonder, what is Iran capable of, whether it be in terms of, as they put it, they don't know the timing, the nature, and the scale. What is their military capabilities at this point, and what avenues do they have to hit the U.S. back?
So the military capabilities of conventional forces are relatively, I won't say intact, but they certainly have not been hit as hard as other targets in Iran, because Israel's been the one that's been hitting the targets. And something we've spoken about in our last several broadcasts, Israel's not that threat from Iran's conventional military and ground forces, with the exception of the ballistic missiles. So Israel has attacked the Air Force in Iran, it has attacked old F-14 planes that they have, it has attacked F-5 planes and things like that, helicopters, but it hasn't gone after Iran's entire navy, for example, which it does have, because Israel's not that threatened by the navy. It hasn't gone after a lot of the ground forces. That said, those ground forces and the navy would be no match for the United States. Iran would very likely not want to enter into a head-to-head military collision with the United States. We've seen this again in Iraq, we've seen this in Afghanistan, we've seen it in lots of places recently where the United States has intervened. The US will suffer losses, but at the end of the day, it does have the more advanced military, and it would succeed. So Iran now is saying that in order to leave all options open. It's a little bit like when Trump says, maybe I'll attack more, maybe I won't. You can come talk to me. Iran is saying, look, we reserve the option to retaliate however we want. Come talk to me. They're trying to play that same game. In terms of what are their options, so first of all, there's the proxy option. That has been argued going to be the most likely option, that Iran will activate either the Houthis to start attacking U.S. interests, or even just Israeli or Western interests in the Red Sea, possibly activate other militias in Jordan and in Iraq. And that's the reason that we've seen the United States pull out a lot of its forces and diplomatic missions from these different countries. It is also possible that Iran will activate cells that it has against Western targets more broadly. This could be in Europe. Hezbollah in 1994 carried out an attack targeting Jews and Israelis in Argentina. Like they have the capability to also activate sleeper cells across the different areas. But again, if that's done by proxy, that will be an indication that Iran, again, does not want to go head to head with the United States. You attack us, all of a sudden, your embassy will be blown up somewhere in Africa. You attack us, all of a sudden, a militia will attack your military bases, but you could retaliate against us, but it's not us trying to go to war. So that's one option, is the proxy option. Another option is Iran could launch an attack either against U.S. interests, not the U.S. specifically, U.S. interests. So that could be further attacks on Israel, more harsher ballistic missiles that are fired. And Iran does have harsher ballistic missiles that it's fired so far, possibly carrying out some sort of terror attacks against Israeli interests. Again, Iran's conventional army may not get to Israel, but it does have agents that could try to carry an attack against an embassy or Israelis abroad. Again, that would be attacks against American interests that might happen coming from Iran directly. A third option would be attacking U.S. bases in the region, and that I would say Iran would, again, probably not do as a soldiers storming a base and trying to take it over. Iran does not want to bear the brunt of the retaliation. That would probably be more in the form of a drone attack, or something that happened that all of a sudden drones detonated in U.S. bases. Not saying that that wouldn't cause death and carnage, but it would be something that would be seen within the game between the countries. You're not at war. Okay, we're not at war. You admitted to bombing out our facilities. We sent some drones and they attacked your barracks. Some people died here, some people died there, and we're done. So I imagine that those are the options that Iran is weighing, whether it wants to go by proxies, whether it wants to attack US interests in sort of a roundabout way, or try to carry out a symbolic attack against the US and admitting to it from Iran itself. But I emphasize it'll be very likely symbolic because Iran, for all of its big talk, really does not want to end up bearing the brunt of a counterattack by the United States that would be much worse.
Sleeper cell has become one of the most Googled search terms in the past 24 hours alone. What is a sleeper cell? Why are people so curious about this idea?
So, sleeper cells are a concept that really is associated with the world of terrorism. And essentially, what that means is slightly different than 9/11. What that means is that you send people who are affiliated with your typically organization, but it equally could be a country. And certainly in the era of the Cold War, this was affiliated a lot with both the United States and the Soviet Union. And you send them to enemy territory without a mission. You send them there to live, but they are loyal to you. They're loyal to you, and they could be activated at any point to carry out a specific mission. That is different than 9/11. 9/11, the hijackers were sent by Al Qaeda with those plans. With the plans, some have argued with the date. Some have argued they didn't know the exact date that it would be carried out, but they went. They infiltrated the United States. They scoured their mission, their area. They learned how to fly. They learned how to bypass security. That's not a sleeper cell. That's an active cell. That's a cell that's there that's constantly working on the attack. A sleeper cell, in turn, is if Iran might have sent some agents, or not even agents, just people who are loyal to the regime, and said, go live in New York. Go live in New York. Live a life. One day, you'll get a message. You'll get a message that says, go do this. And then you're activated. You become an active cell. The reason that that is so scary to most people is that one, it could be anyone, and that ferments a lot of fear in the population. All of a sudden, wait a minute, you immigrated from here to there. What does that say about you? And two, it is a lot harder for counterterrorism measures to intercept, as opposed to an active cell that is always working. Theoretically, if the apartments of the 9/11 attackers would have been raided and their computers actually opened and looked at, the plans would have been discovered. A sleeper cell often doesn't even know what the plans are. They are activated at a point in time. So that is something that now everyone is fearful of because, again, it goes back to the Cold War era, but in this case, Iran theoretically could have agents that are spread around the world that they will try to activate in order to carry out that attack. And again, the big thing with that is deniability because these are people who have lived somewhere else now for X amount of time. They're not soldiers of the regime. You attacked Iran. Suddenly now your embassy has blown up. Suddenly now something has happened, and that would give Iran the deniability that it would want to try to avoid the retaliation.
So, you mentioned this earlier, the idea that just within the past hour or two, we've still heard of strikes from Iran targeting Israel. Catch us up. A lot of us have been focusing on the U.S.-Iran piece of everything, but as you said, the Israel-Iran piece has not gone anywhere. What's been happening as of late? Are we still seeing Israel and Iran trading strikes, or is this a one-way street at this point, Iran toward Israel?
Oh no, they're both trading strikes. Israel has been carrying out airstrikes in Iran every night since the operation started. What Israel has named the Operation Rising Lion. Airstrikes every night. Iran has fired missiles towards Israel almost every night and some days. That is still ongoing. Israel has issued several contradictory statements. The official statements have been, complete glee and thank and awe of the U.S. for carrying out those bombing raids, and at the same time saying, but that doesn't end our campaign. Our campaign isn't over. We still have a bank of targets. We still want to make sure the nuclear facilities are destroyed. We still want to make sure the ballistic missiles are destroyed. And again, that term bank of targets is deliberately vague because that may include also regime targets that aren't just nuclear targets or ballistic missile targets, but also targets that are affiliated with the regime. On the one hand, Israel has said publicly that this does not end our mission. On the other hand, Israel has also said more anonymously, sources within the government, which usually is the government itself, have also opened the possibility that Israel would actually be willing to recognize an end to the ongoing escalation. No one's talking realistically about any agreement between Israel and Iran. Even when Trump said now is the time for peace, I don't think even Trump thinks that he's going to bring Iran and Israel to a peace treaty at this point. But the tacit agreement between the countries being possibly the two countries will agree we are done now. We're not retaliating against each other. We've seen this. We saw this in April and in October, November of 2024 when the countries traded blows, and then they just sent signals to each other saying, now we're done. Israel has opened that possibility and said, we're willing to consider silence will be met with silence, i.e., instead of the common phrase fire will be met with fire, silence will be met with silence. We could be done now. I think that Israel's largely doing that because it really wants to appease Trump at this point. Trump wants to see an end to escalations. Again, that's his motto. Very, very contradictory and unpredictable about a lot of things. The thing that is pretty consistent, he does not like escalations of war. He wants to see an end to this escalation. And Israel wants to be the one that is always saying, as far as we're concerned, we could be done. As far as we're concerned, we're welcome to go back to a time when we're not fighting with each other. Iran is the one that's not agreeing. And Trump is doing the same thing. Those bombing campaigns were launched in the initial moment that they were declared. Trump said, we carried out the bombing campaigns, and now is the time for peace. So theoretically, now Iran is the one that's rejecting peace because Trump is offering it. So similarly, anonymous sources within Israel want to say, we are also agreeing to that. But officially, Israel is saying, as long as there's no agreement, as long as the United States is not requested, there's still a bank of targets, and we are still continuing. And that one more thing I'll say, the Israeli government, unlike Trump that issued that one message, the Israeli government is talking much more openly about regime change, much more openly about what it has issued messages about the Persian people being liberated, and things like that. So while in the United States, it's only that one message from Trump that really opened the door to that. In Israel, that is being discussed. I will say that I would estimate, based on what I've seen so far, that even if Israel were interested in trying to impose a regime change, it will not do that unless the United States approves. And so far, we haven't seen the United States actually approving that. The United States, like I said, Trump wants to see an end to this. I think he's very, very worried about having an Iraq replica on his hands. Right, he came to power pretty much as the Republican who said it's time to stop saying that Iraq was a good idea. It's time to stop saying that that worked out well. It did not work out well. I think that he's very fearful of ending up embroiled in that. Certainly, if Israel were to be the one to continue to go for regime change, if he doesn't want it.
Trump says that it's time for peace with Iran. And let's expand on what you've just been talking about. How much of that is up to him?
Theoretically, I'll take us back to 79. There was a peace. It was a close alliance between Iran and Israel, Iran and the United States. That's less likely under the current administration. I think that rather than peace, it could be, we could replace that with, it's time to stop fighting. That is more up to Trump. Theoretically, we will see an Iranian retaliation. We very likely will. But it could be something the United States would absorb. We saw this already in 2020. The United States, under Trump, assassinated Qasem Soleimani, and Iran did retaliate, again, through proxies. The United States did not take that as an opportunity now to escalate. It was like, okay, we came out the upper hand. We had the major assassination. You did something small. You get to tell your people you did something, and we're absorbing that. If Iran carries out a retaliation that allows the United States to do that, right? If it's not something massive that allows the United States to do that, then it is to some extent up to the United States to say, now let's return to calm between the United States and Iran, right? Right now it's in Iran's court, but Iran is going to throw it back to the United States, and it will be up to Trump at that point. Then the question becomes, what about Israel? I've said this many times. Israel wants to say, and often does say, and in reality, it's true, it's not just a star in the U.S. flag. It's not one of the states that Trump can order, this is what's going to happen there, in theory. In practice, Israel, especially in the current context under Netanyahu and and the United States under Trump, Israel is more dependent on the United States than it ever has been in its existence. The war in Gaza has led to a lot of allies of Israel that in the past would have at least tacitly agreed with Israel's actions in the Palestinian territories, if not openly, to be outright against those actions. The latest UN Security Council vote that wanted to impose a ceasefire on the Gaza Strip and also called for the release of hostages and the end of humanitarian aid, but the clause that Israel disagreed with, that it would impose a ceasefire and require Israel to withdraw its troops, had 14 votes in favor, 14 out of 15. It was only the United States that voted against it and vetoed it. That is not something we've seen in the past. In the past, we've seen countries like France, United Kingdom, some other countries sometimes in the Security Council either abstain, maybe even vote the way Israel wants. That's gone now. Israel is entirely dependent on the United States for diplomatic support and also for armaments. More and more countries have said that they will no longer sell weapons to Israel, and they've passed laws with that. So all that's to say, with regards to if the United States, if it's up to Trump to bring calm back to the situation, it could be up to him between the United States and Iran. While theoretically that would leave Israel and Iran to keep fighting, Trump could tell Netanyahu if he wanted, and now you're done. We've attacked Fordo, we've attacked Isfahan, we've destroyed Natanz, and now you're done. Israel would not say this openly. My analysis would be Israel would be done the moment Trump would say it was done. So to a large extent, it is up to him, but a lot of it depends on Iran's retaliation. What is the nature of that? Is it something that the U.S. can absorb?
Has the supreme leader said anything about this attack himself? Have we heard a statement from him?
I haven't seen specific statements from him. I've seen a lot of statements that have been issued from ministers and from the president, and I think that there's a reason for that. I think that he right now is not sure what to say to some extent. Because he is the hardliner. He represents the more extreme side of the Iranian political establishment on the one hand. On the other hand, saying that we are now going to rain fire in the United States, I don't think that they actually want to. So I think that it's a safer place for him to not say anything. One. Two, leaving things vague. I think that he wants the world leadership and, you and me, because I'm sure he's thinking about us, to be thinking, what is he thinking? What is he thinking? What is he planning at this stage? I will say I might have missed those statements because
I've seen reports that he's been pretty quiet, actually.
At this point, I haven't seen statements coming out, and I would say it's a tactical move. Also for internal politics, it's a dangerous thing to say anything right now, so better not say anything. But also externally, let everyone think, what am I thinking at this point? Again, the thing that is most important, I would say, that came out of him from the last week is the fact that he appointed 3 possible successors to his position, and he also called for the convening of the Council of Elders, that is the one that elects a successor, and said, I want you to do this fast, rather than a process that usually takes months of consultations. Do this fast. I want to mark a successor. That is him, with all due religious fanaticism, which he does have, also recognizing realpolitik, there is a good chance, or at least a chance, that I will be assassinated, and he wants to see the regime continue.
Alon, we do know that Trump has warned the U.S. could launch more attacks if Tehran does not make peace. If the U.S. were to go for more strikes, here's the 3 spots that have been hit. We've been looking at these. Fordo, of course, that's the most critical one. Natanz, that's largest uranium enrichment center. Isfahan was believed to be a repository of near bomb-grade nuclear fuel. Those are the 3 targets that they've hit. Let's say there's another round. Are there any other obvious targets that stand out to you?
So here I'm going to add something that I realize now looking at the map that I should have said before. When it comes to Iran's possible retaliations, I neglected to mention closing the Straits of Hormuz. Mm-hmm. That is something that is a critical thing that Iran could do that is not unto itself a violent act of war, but it would heavily affect world commerce and heavily affect the movement of oil, because if you keep this map up for a second, the Straits of Hormuz are that point that juts out, that goes into Iran from the south. in the sea there. And very importantly, not only does Iran export its oil from there, but Saudi Arabia, which is the country that is south on the map here, also exports its oil through the northern sea that it has, the Persian Gulf, going through the Straits of Hormuz. So if Iran were to block off that narrow passage of the Straits, that would really affect the world's oil trade. And that is another possible retaliation of Iran. And the reason I brought this up now is because if the United States were to carry out another round, again, I don't see the United States landing troops on the ground in Iran or trying to invade. More likely, we would see them targeting strategic sites of Iran. This could be continuous attacks against Tehran, the military capabilities of Iran, or possibly, again striking at the different nuclear sites that they have, like Natanz and Isfahan had been attacked by Israel before, but the United States attacked them again to make sure they were destroyed. But it is also very likely that instead of doing that, the United States would actually target Iran's naval capabilities in order to stop them, to deny them that possibility of closing the Straits of Hormuz. Again, Iran does have a powerful navy, does have submarines, does have the ability to deploy sea mines there. So possibly the United States would attack the different major ports in Iran, the Badr port, the different, never mind, I can't show them on the map, the different ports in Iran that Iran would use in order to launch a navy attack and block the Straits of Hormuz. That may be something that the United States would do because that would remove Iran's big economic threat, which we all know is something that Trump cares about. I won't say necessarily most, but certainly cares about. And that may remove the economic threat that Iran has. That's total speculation on my part. I don't know what the United States would do. I'm not sure the United States knows either because it very much, again, depends on Iran's retaliation. If they retaliate against U.S. bases, the United States would probably be more likely to launch a military response. In turn, if, again, all of a sudden explosions go off in a U.S. embassy somewhere, then the United States may attack government administration facilities in Iran. I think it's going to largely mirror the nature of Iran's retaliation.
I want to ask you something that I asked Hal yesterday. Let's connect some of this stuff. Let's connect Iran with the Gaza war, with Hezbollah, with the Houthis. Let's say there is a regime change. Let's say that Khamenei's regime falls. Let's say that that moves forward. What happens to the Iranian proxies that we've been talking about now since October of 2023? We know Hezbollah as their chief proxy, Houthis another one. Hamas, not so much as of late. Of course, the lines of communication and resources been cut off, basically. So if that regime goes down, what happens to Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, and other proxies?
It's a great question. It really depends on the proxy and the political environment that they are in. The Houthis, for example, control a large part of Yemen. They have controlled large parts of Yemen since 2014. And in 2020, after fighting a bitter war, civil war, and a war with Saudi Arabia, they actually began negotiating a ceasefire with Saudi Arabia, which means to some extent recognizing their administration. If they lost the support of Iran, it would affect them. It would not mean major change for Yemen. They still control large parts of it, and the Houthis would succeed. However, they would continue to fund themselves and rebuild weaponry. They would be weakened, but it wouldn't affect them that much. In turn, situations like Hezbollah, where the movement has been vastly weakened by Israel during Israel's campaign and primarily the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, and also the injuries that most operatives or most high-ranking operatives had as a result of the pager attack and walkie-talkie attack. Hezbollah now is Iran's chief proxy, as you said, and they are so far not retaliating to anything in the war. They're making a lot of statements, but are not retaliating to the attacks on Iran itself. If Iran's support for Hezbollah were to all of a sudden disappear, regime change or what have you, Hezbollah would very likely start to disintegrate and be absorbed into the Lebanese political establishment. It is a political movement in Lebanon. It's also a military wing and a terror organization, but it also has a political wing. Likely, it would very quickly try to just become a political wing, advocating war against Israel, advocating expanding Shiitism and etc., but not necessarily doing more than that. The other proxies, I'll get to Hamas in a moment, the other proxies throughout the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, would probably just turn into local warlords because they, unlike Hezbollah, which is a political party within a game of politics in Lebanon, unlike the Houthis that dominate and control parts of Yemen, those other militias, they themselves are not part of the local political scene. So they are somewhat loyal to Iran. If Iran were to disappear, they are armed to the teeth and they would simply become local warlords. Everyone's wondering what happens to Hamas. In Israel, the narrative that is being pumped by the government is that weakening Iran, like everyone's asking, you have hostages that are still held, 20 live hostages still held in Gaza. Why are you going to war with Iran now? And what the government has repeatedly said is that this will help with the hostage deal because Hamas will feel that its main ally, Iran, has been weakened. That is true to some extent. Hamas will feel if Iran were to disappear, again, the Iran's support for Hamas were to disappear, Hamas would feel it, but would feel it much more long term. Israel has shown documents that Mohammed Sinwar, brother of Yahya Sinwar, and others were in contact with Iran about long-term investments that Iran would do in the military wing, $20 million in order to rebuild. That's not happening during the war. That's all happening later on. So it likely would not affect Hamas's situation right now with regards to the ongoing fighting in Gaza. What it might affect, and this is one other aspect that I'll add in, is Hamas's external leadership. External leadership is not housed in Iran. It is housed in Qatar primarily. Some of it travels a little bit in Lebanon and Turkey, but primarily in Qatar. They are, however, politically backed up by Iran, most of them. If Iran were to all of a sudden remove its support from Hamas, Qatar at some point may say, okay, you know what? It's too politically damaging for us to even house these leaders anymore. Right now, there's still players within the Middle East scene, but if all of their backers are one by one disappearing, you know what? We don't want to have anything to do with them anymore. Then they may relocate to Egypt, Iraq, other places that the leadership has been before. But that's how it would affect. I don't see it having a direct effect on Gaza at this point.
The Supreme Leader has a Twitter account. He hasn't posted for over 24 hours. The last thing he posted, Palestine is a central issue to us, and the victory of Palestinians is something that's definite. What's been going on in Gaza while we've been focusing on Iran alone?
So a lot's been going on in Gaza over the last week and a half. All eyes have been on Iran, but really there have been, I would say, three main developments. One is that the IDF pulled out a lot of its ground forces that were actively fighting in Gaza. Who remembers that we were talking about Gideon's chariots, the main IDF push into Gaza. The IDF pulled out a lot of its ground forces out of fear of Iranian proxies doing cross-border insurgencies elsewhere. So all of a sudden, those troops were stationed on the eastern border of Israel with Jordan, or in the north with Syria. That led to a couple of changes within the Gaza Strip. First of all, the Al-Qassam brigades, Hamas woke up. They saw that the IDF is distracted, and we've seen a lot more engagement of the Al-Qassam brigades, not in open combat necessarily, but we've had 3 IDF soldiers killed and many more injured over the last week as a result of guerrilla-style operations. The Al-Qassam brigades all of a sudden are sending operatives to plant explosive devices on IDF vehicles, and then they're exploding, sniper attacks. And at the same time, so that's the Al-Qassam brigades, at the same time, the IDF has also really amped up its airstrikes in the Gaza Strip over the last week. Again, associated with the removal of ground forces, in lieu of ground forces advancing more and more, we're seeing many more airstrikes. So that is one development that has happened in the fighting. And those airstrikes have led to, again, a lot of deaths in the last week, reportedly over 300 airstrikes and over 409 Palestinians that have been killed, both militants and civilians. One avenue. Another big development that happened, this was completely overshadowed because this happened pretty much at the same time as the US attack, but the IDF managed to recover the bodies of 3 hostages that had been killed on October 7th, and their bodies had been kidnapped back to the Gaza Strip. This happened on Saturday night, and their bodies have been returned. Now we are left with 50 hostages in the Gaza Strip. 20 of them are considered alive. 3 of them are very likely dead, but Israel hasn't declared that officially, and the rest are confirmed dead. That is another big development that happened. And it's not only big in the human sense and humane sense of bringing people back to burial with their family, it also has some significance to the fact that the negotiations are for a certain amount of hostages and the bodies of a certain amount of hostages, but that number has now shifted again as those bodies were recovered. That's the second thing. And the third thing is there's been a constant development of the Gaza Humanitarian Fund. The humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip has been one of the key points in this war. We've talked about it at length. Starting on March 2nd, for almost 6 weeks or 8 or 7 weeks, Israel completely cut off humanitarian aid into Gaza. And there were very harsh conditions, and famine was developing. Then the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation set up these new distribution sites, and they've started operating. That's a mixed bag. On the one hand, it has been quite successful in reducing the hunger in the Gaza Strip, and that extent, obviously, it's a positive thing on the humane and human factor. On the other hand, there's also been repeated acts of violence that are coming up around there because, unlike the humanitarian aid trucks, this is a stationary place. And as a result, there's been both Hamas attacks because they don't like this operating, and also a lot of Palestinian deaths as a result of IDF fire. One incident of 50 Palestinians being killed from an IDF tank that fired into a crowd. Other incidents happened of 12 Palestinians being killed. So that's a bit of a mixed bag. There's been this development that they're fully operational, those distribution centers, in the last week. It's doing good in terms of reducing hunger, but also is becoming a focal point of violence that we'll see how it develops.
Alon Burstein being generous with his time tonight. We appreciate the time. Alon posts his own Middle East updates on his personal YouTube channel. You can go give him a subscribe. Alon, as always, thanks. We'll see you soon. Have a good night.